The Down Syndrome Resource Foundation in British Columbia is working to support its members during this pandemic. Many have had to move to online learning, and it seems like a lot of them have taken to liking it.
Like doing things online.
I love it. Online's my favorite thing. I see the people that I love.
It makes me feel happy to see everyone.
My teachers really helped me do this amazing.
Online's my favorite thing too. Wayne Leslie is the head of the Down Syndrome Resource Foundation, and he recently wrote a letter to the BC government requesting that people with Down syndrome be given priority during the vaccine rollout. He's joining us from Vancouver. Wayne, thank you so much for joining us.
Thank you for having us.
So Wayne, give us your argument. Why should people with Down syndrome be made a priority when it comes to the vaccine rollout?
The short answer is the genetic condition that is Down syndrome comes with associated physical and mental health problems that make this community especially vulnerable to COVID-19. As we noted in our letter to Dr. Henry and the Provincial Health Office, 4 times more likely if they contract COVID-19 to be hospitalized, and 10 times the mortality rate of the typical population without Down syndrome.
And what's been the response to your letter?
So far, we're still waiting. But as we've mentioned to others we've spoken to, we recognize that everybody's working flat out in this jurisdiction and all other jurisdictions in Canada. We're hopeful that by early next week we'll receive some answers, but we recognize that Dr. Henry and Minister Dix and their team are balancing a lot of various priorities. Premier Horgan spoke to the media a couple of days ago mentioning that there's a lot of incoming information that they're trying to sort through. So we recognize it's going to take a little bit of time, but we're confident they will see the value in prioritizing this issue.
Now, Wayne, did I hear you correctly that people with Down syndrome are 10 times more likely to die because of COVID-19?
That is absolutely correct. There was a study done last year in the early stages of the pandemic. It's now been published in the Annals of Internal Medicine. And one of the startling findings was that for adults, and that leads to our priority recommendation that adults over the age of 40 be prioritized right now for vaccinations in much the same way that the elderly in the typical population in long-term care are being prioritized, because their death rate is 10 times more likely because of the various health conditions, which include everything from congenital heart problems to immune dysfunction. They're especially vulnerable if they contract the disease.
I'm so glad you brought up the relation to senior citizens, because that's been a point of focus throughout the story of this pandemic, that we know that seniors are vulnerable, and that's where the focus is on the vaccination rollout in many countries, including our own. Why have we not previously focused on people with, is it specifically Down syndrome, or is it people with developmental disabilities as a whole?
Well, in particular for us, it's Down syndrome. So Down syndrome is a genetic condition. One of the common characteristics of Down syndrome is a developmental disability or cognitive disorders. But in particular with Down syndrome, the key link, and I'm glad you mentioned the focus on the aged or the elderly in long-term care, because of the way the body ages when you have Down syndrome, someone in their 40s has very typical aging health-related problems that you would see in the typical population of people in their 70s and 80s. So as an example, I spoke to an organization in Vancouver yesterday who called to ask us what we were doing and had more questions about the advocacy that we're doing. And they were representing an individual gentleman who is 58 with Down syndrome. The average lifespan for someone with Down syndrome is 60. So in other words, this gentleman with 58 as his age, living in a group setting, is the equivalent of someone in their early 80s who is living in a group setting. But currently, because Down syndrome is not recognized as an increased risk group, he's not been identified as needing priority vaccination to make sure he is safe, and he's at a great deal of risk.
I'm just shocked at why this isn't a priority, a larger priority. Why isn't this something that we hear about at the countless press conferences that are held at all levels of government when we speak to so many doctors? Why hasn't anyone brought this up as a major issue?
I think to this date, it's one of the endemic problems that you have with a relatively small population. So in terms of the Down syndrome population in Canada, we estimate anywhere between 45 and 50,000. In British Columbia, we narrow that to about 4,000 people. So typically, it is sadly a population whose issues and stories and needs tend to be overlooked at best, and I would say at worst marginalized. And that's where DSRF is one of the leading Down syndrome organizations in Canada, and certainly the leading Down syndrome organization in British Columbia. At this time, even though we're primarily a service provider, we do advocacy, and we feel that given the critical health issue that we're talking about, we've really amplified this, and it's rocketed to the top of the charts in terms of our efforts to make sure the voice of the community is heard.
I wonder if I could ask you, because we've spoken to a lot of folks, primarily parents of children with autism, about how difficult the pandemic has been for them. You know, people with autism don't like dramatic changes in their schedule, you know, generally speaking. And for many young children with autism, it's affected their developmental abilities because they're not interacting, so it's making them more reclusive. I wonder, have you noticed any patterns amongst individuals who have Down syndrome?
We have. So that's one of the areas that DSRF works specifically in. And that was really the leading edge of our second recommendation, which was to give priority consideration for individuals with Down syndrome between the ages of 16 and 39 who deal with similar physical health issues because of their condition. And while they may be, because of their age, in a better position to manage those physically, there are current and then at risk of long-term development and mental health issues. In particular, because a common characteristic of Down syndrome are developmental disabilities, they often struggle and sometimes simply can't manage the safety protocols for COVID-19, like masking and social distancing, which means for their safety, they either limit or don't have the necessary in-person services. And the clip you gave was a good example. It was done in the middle of the pandemic last year, when, quite frankly, our families from all across Canada that were tapping into our virtual services were saying, you know, thank goodness, because we don't have any other resources. But as this has continued to grow and lengthen in terms of the time that it's taking to deal with this, families are telling us, and we are seeing this through our own work with families and children and young adults and even into adulthood ourselves, that it's really taking its toll now. And so it was one thing to go for a few months with no in-person services, but now they run the risk of not only having development lacking, but unlike a lot of us, where it's just a matter of delaying, and then we know when things get back to normal, we'll kind of get back and recover lost ground. For some development aspects, especially with mental health, it's ground that may not be made up. And so for that reason, we ask that the 16 to 39-year-old age group for Down syndrome, which is the most common age group that is continuing to receive these, or now in the case of the pandemic, not receive these essential services from organizations like DSRF, are prioritized so at least within their small bubble, they can start seeing their therapist or their educator or their mental health provider.
Wayne, I wish you the best of luck with this, and thank you so much for your time.
Thank you, Natasha.
Wayne Leslie, CEO of the Down Syndrome Resource Foundation, speaking to us from Vancouver.